Richmond friends and fans. Welcome to the Cultural Arts Center of Glen Allen. My name is Karen Davis and I'm the Communications Director for the Camera Club of Richmond. We are happy to be here with our exhibit in the Slantwell Gallery, which is off here to my left. And we would like to take you on a little bit of a tour of some of the photos that our photographers have put into the exhibit here. Photographers from the Camera Club of Richmond have presented 27 of their best works for your viewing pleasure here at the Glen Allen Cultural Arts Center. The exhibit was envisioned by our club secretary from 2018 to 2022, Frank Mercado. This is what Frank had to say about the genesis of his idea. I had to define an exhibit title when I finalized the contract with Glen Allen Cultural Arts Center. This was in April of last year. The exhibit title is required for their advertising purposes. I chose the title Sight Unseen because I wanted the exhibit's viewers to understand that art photographers often see the world in ways that non-photographers do not. I also wanted a theme statement that CCR exhibit organizers could use to curate entries so that our exhibit would be consistent with the exhibit title. This is the description of our exhibit, Sight Unseen. Some of the artists in this exhibit looked out to the world and recognized that a particular scene, if captured just so, reveals a visual poem, often hidden by the obvious. Other artists looked inward to their imagination, then constructed the story for their cameras so that they could share what otherwise we would not be able to see. Whatever their muse, all of the artists in this exhibit wish to share with you the sometimes unseen truths, beauty, fantasies, and abstractions that they see with their photographer's eye.
From a young age, photography had been an important aspect of Louis Katz's life. He had fond memories of his father using a twin-lens reflex camera, which was soon replaced with a Konica rangefinder that he carried with him everywhere. Family vacations and private moments were captured and shared through slideshows. Louis's first camera was an Olympus Pen F, and he eventually progressed through the full line of Olympus OM models. He continues to use Olympus cameras but has also added a Nikon to his collection since the advent of digital cameras. Photography served as an outlet for Louis's suppressed feelings and artistic expression, as emotive displays were uncommon in his household. It was during his time living in southern York County, Pennsylvania, that he discovered landscape photography, which became a passion he pursued further while traveling to national parks across the country during his career in the travel industry. Upon moving to Baltimore in 2001, Louis joined the Baltimore Camera Club, where he found companionship and was in awe of the talent present. The club remains an integral part of his photography life, and he has received numerous awards from the club's competitions. Sharing his passion for photography through teaching is also an essential component of his photography life. He teaches for the Johns Hopkins Odyssey program, the Capitol Photography Center of DC, and private students. Louis lives for those aha moments that teaching can provide. Louis's favorite quote by Ansel Adams is, "A great photograph is one that truly expresses what one feels, in the deepest sense, about what is being photographed." His photography reflects who he is and all the experiences of his life, just as a camera captures the light being reflected.
The name of the program is Abstract Photography, a Personal Journey. And why did I add a personal journey? I added a personal journey because of what I just said before. Abstract photography means different things to different photographers. So what I'm sharing with you is my journey through finding out what I consider to be abstract, and putting together a program of a series of abstract images that I've taken over the past, really, some of the older ones are like 14, 15 years old. So that's why I call it a personal journey, because everybody's journey, first of all, in photography is always different from anybody else's. But when you talk about abstract photography, it really starts differing from everybody else's. So this is really a personal, I'm not trying to teach what abstract photography is or isn't. I'm just sharing with you my thoughts about abstract photography. My website is then listed. I was lucky when I went out to get my website, my name was still available. So it's just www.louiskatzphotography.com. I urge everybody at some point to take a look. I live in Baltimore, Maryland. I shoot urban, I shoot rural, I do street photography, I do a whole melange of different kinds of photography, which are listed under my website. And then there's an email address, Olympus, obviously, one of my cameras, and my zip code, 21209 @yahoo.com. That's the email address you should use if you have any questions at any point about what we saw tonight, or really anything photography related, because that's a pure photography email address. That email address is not used for household things. So it really segregates out everything that's related to photography. So here are just some quotes about abstract, and they're not necessarily from photographers. To abstract is to draw out the essence of a matter. To abstract in art is to separate certain fundamentals from irrelevant material which surrounds them. That was from Ben Shahn. A lot of these folks are writers and painters. Abstract art has helped us to experience the emotional power in pure form. You cannot look at abstract art without thinking. I like that one a lot. But the one I really like the most is the next one. Abstract art is a fundamental distrust of the theory of reality concocted by the eyes. And what that is referring to is that we walk through the world with our eyes and our brains interpreting the data that's in front of us. And the way we as humans interpret that data is in a purely literal sense, meaning that, when you're driving and you're driving carefully, the cars that you see on the road are cars. They don't represent really anything else. They don't look like anything else. But when you get more to a thing like trees, they may look like trees at first, but if you can start thinking non-literally, meaning that you distrust what your brain and eyes are telling you, and you're interpreting them in a non-literal way, that's about the best definition that I can give to abstract photography, is distrusting what your brain and eyes are telling you what's in front of you, what it really is. Because to get into abstract work, you have to start thinking, well, yeah, that's what it looks like in the literal world, but maybe in the non-literal world, it would look completely different. And then Georgia O'Keeffe, I found that I could say things with color and shape that I could not say any other way because it represents something else. So those are just some quotes about just abstractness, in general. And I have a few others that I may just sprinkle in through the program. All right, so these are some of the older images that I was referring to, similar to you guys, because we're north of you, but you guys know what I'm going to say, and you're going to agree with what I say, which is that we used to have much colder weather than we do now. I mean, this winter in particular has been incredibly mild. Once again, we've had absolutely no snow, but 15, 16, 17 years ago, that wasn't the case. Temperatures would drop into the teens on a fairly regular basis, and they would stay there for like 4 or 5 days sometimes before a little warming trend would occur. So when the weather got that cold, about 5 or 6 of us from the camera club would venture out completely bundled up, down coats, hoods, gloves, scarves, the whole thing. And we would go to a river that's near Baltimore called the Susquehanna River that empties out into the Chesapeake Bay. And there's a dam over the Susquehanna called the Conowingo Dam. And it would, on a regular basis, release water through the conduits so that the pressure behind the dam wouldn't build up to too high a level. And as the water receded after it came through, it would then recede back toward the dam. As it hit the shore, it would instantaneously freeze because it was so cold outside. And we all brought our macro lenses and our tripods, and we started interpreting what we were seeing. And what you're seeing is everything that you're seeing as an object is underwater. And the little bubbles that you can see are air bubbles that are just trapped in the water. So those are rocks underneath the water and leaves and plants, all underneath a very thin veneer of ice. And so here's one image from that time period. And here's another image from that time period. Now here the seed pod is laying on top of the ice and staying, instead of being underneath. And I have a couple of others. Yeah, here's a frozen maple leaf that actually was up on a berm, and the water level got high enough so it covered the berm and then froze again instantaneously. I think that's the only one I have from. No, here's another one. This is using my macro at full power to interpret a rock that was again trapped underneath the ice, and you could see all those nice curves and other shapes, to the right and on the top of it. And these images represent the first time that I really thought to myself, wow, these are not living in the literal world. They're really living in the non-literal world, at least to my eyes and to my brain. And this was the beginning of me realizing what abstract photography could potentially be all about, is finding subject matter that broke that link between literal and non-literal in terms of the way your eyes and your brain were interpreting what you were seeing. So these are the oldest images that represented that kind of, photography to me. And it's funny, when I go out shooting either by myself or with my friends and I'm looking for things that are abstract, I don't find them. I find them when I'm just in general out shooting and all of a sudden something catches my eye and I say, oh, that could be looked at in a couple of different ways. So it's kind of interesting that when I purposely go out to look for abstract art, I don't usually find it. I usually find it when I see something else that leads me to something that I can interpret in an abstract way. So here's the same river, but on a totally different weather situation. I forget whether this was spring or fall, but as I walked by and I saw this rock formation, to me, these rocks look like they're floating on top of the water. And I got that nice cloud reflection from the sky. I think the bigger rock in the front has sort of a reptilian shape to it, maybe like an alligator or a crocodile head. And I like the rocks that lead off into the background because they kind of ground the larger rock that's in the foreground. So again, in the literal world, these are just rocks that are throwing really interesting shadows, onto the surface of the water. But in the non-literal world, they almost look like they are their own being, so to speak. And that's what I'm kind of looking for when I'm looking for something that I consider to be abstract. We are not surrounded by water, but the city of Baltimore, faces the ocean, basically. And there are always boats in the harbor in Baltimore runs for a very long distance. So you have lots of opportunity to look into the water or look at the water and purposely look for really interesting reflections and patterns. And a lot of those are caused by oil slicks that, the vessel, whatever it be, a small boat or a large tugboat, emits just naturally from its engines, and they form really interesting patterns in the water. And in this particular case, the colors that the oil slicks were picking up from the surrounding buildings, I didn't find to be too pleasant. So I converted this to a black and white. And I really, really enjoyed the patterns that these oil slicks were throwing off. And you can actually, this part of the image right here is really more of a pure reflection of the scene that's right above it. And it's just reflecting into the water. So water is a big theme for me in general. And it's certainly a big theme for me in looking for abstract, either art as it stands by itself, or things that I could consider abstract. With a little extra work in the digital darkroom, I can make them, in a way, a little more abstract. So my wife and I were in Colorado on a vacation, and she was walking over a little cement bridge that went over a small river, and she looked down on the water, and she immediately said, "Louis, you got to come over here and see the way the sunlight is reflecting off of what's in the water." And what's really in the water are just rocks that are, but the quality of the light that they're reflecting from the sun is completely abstract. It's not, in the literal world, these are just rocks laying in a small riverbed. In the non-literal world, this could be almost anything. What I really, really enjoyed were the jewel tones that these rocks were throwing off. And as you got to the bottom of the image, the jewel tones sort of disappeared and it became more blue-green. And I picked this image because I like this bottom rock right here, which I considered to be an anchor rock that sort of led your eyes into the rest of the image. And I really didn't have to pump up these colors very much. These really were what they look like. And my wife is used to hearing me say this, which was, "Oh, hon, we're going to be here for another like 40 minutes because this is really great material, for photography." And so I did spend like another half hour just creating images off of these beautiful reflections, from the reflections off of these rocks from the sun. Anytime you have to ask sort of like what it is, that's a good sign that you're on the right track to potentially creating something that has a more abstract quality to it. This is a fence that is perfectly straight, that is being bent by the effect of the water and the effect of where the sun is and where it's catching the reflections. And again, talking about oil slicks, that's what this is on the top. This is a big oil slick up here. And you can kind of see windows, a little line of windows right there. And that's again being picked up from the nearby buildings. But the rest of the image, I just really enjoyed looking at. And I like creating images that ask questions that are not necessarily so easy to answer. And some people might look at this and say, "Oh, that's definitely a fence and it's just being bent by the reflection, in the water." And other people might look at this and say, "Gee, I really can't figure out exactly what that is." Either way, it definitely fit into what I considered, my abstract portfolio, because I keep a separate folder in Lightroom, and that's where I really store all my abstract, images. You can create abstracts by just, if you have a river that has a current and you play with different shutter speeds, usually between like a fourth and maybe a little lower than a fourth, maybe a third to like an eighth of a second, depending on how strong the current is and what aperture you use and what shutter speed you use, you're always going to come out with an image that has a very interesting abstract quality to it, because the combination of the river current and the shutter speed that you use is always going to create a completely unique image. I mean, I have 10 other images of the same reflection in the Gunpowder River, all at different shutter speeds, and they all look completely different. The ones that have slower shutter speeds are more blurred out. The ones that have faster shutter speeds more freeze the action, which is not what I wanted at all. And I just chose this one as what I thought was the most attractive one. And again, in the literal world, these are trees being reflected in a river. But in the non-literal world, it's just a beautiful piece of art that has a really kind of nice abstract, quality to it. And the trees that are not being seen are up on the hill up here, and the sun is coming through them and throwing these really nice reflections on the water. And here's another example. And again, two trees that are slightly darker than the rest of the scene. This is in a different part of the county and a different piece of water. But again, it's a combination of the current and your settings. And this is the one that I picked because I thought in this, whatever shutter speed, and I can look at my metadata right here in Lightroom, whatever shutter speed this one was shot gave me the best overall feeling of having an abstract quality to it, because you can clearly see that these are trees being reflected. But in this particular case, I think I used a much slower shutter speed, so you really feel more of the current as it goes past the reflections of the trees in the river. So again, but when you're playing with these kinds of images, every shutter speed is going to give you a different looking image, because it's a combination of the current and the shutter speed that really make up the overall impact of the image. So Baltimore used to be an old factory and mill town, and most of the factories have closed and most of the mills have closed. We used to make sailcloth for sailboats in Baltimore. We made lots of things. And of course, all that industry, along with what happened in the rest of most of the United States, it just sort of disappeared. But there's one big industrial complex still left, and it's called the Crown Cork and Seal Company. And it was the company that made all the bottle caps that everyone in the country used in between like 1915 and 1925. The buildings of the complex still are standing. They're being reused for cottage industries and for other like art studios and things like that. And I became very familiar. It's a large complex. It must have 7 or 8. Some are red brick buildings. Some are more made of just sheets of warehouse type metal. But I also knew that in between the buildings, there weren't just ruts. There were really carved out areas in the concrete, which meant that every time it rained, if you went back the next day, those, cracks or, chasms would be filled with water, and you could just play with reflections. And so this was just a shot of a reflection of one of the red brick buildings. And what really drew my eye were the open windows with this guy right here. There's a window open there. There's a window open down here. And this is some sort of steam vent that actually the very, very top is sticking out of the water. But you can see from the curve going down the pipe that this part of it is actually underwater. And I purposely shot it at a really strong oblique line, a diagonal line, because it really added some drama to the picture. If I would have shot this sort of just straight on, where the lines were completely straight, I don't really think it would have had the same sort of overall impact, because I think it would have made the image more static, where right now I think there's some nice movement, in this image created by the window panes and everything else that's made up of the image. So this is how sometimes abstracts are made. My friend and I, probably 4 or 5 months ago, were driving in what's called northern Baltimore County, which is about a half hour from my house. And we were driving down a country road that we had never taken before. And right off the side of the road was this small waterfall. And you could see it's being fed by a river. It's a small river, and it doesn't have much of a current. But when it hits the edge, it certainly becomes, a small waterfall. And so this was our first view, of the scene. And then we took our tripods out and we created, an image that looked like this, which is, I think, your typical waterfall image. And when I looked at this image on my LCD screen, I literally screamed and said, how many times am I going to take a similar picture of a waterfall? Now, this one was flowing a little more slowly, so it gave me the opportunity to try and be a little more abstract, even in the way I was capturing the waterfall. But I was also just frustrated with the fact that it looked like so many other waterfall pictures that either I had taken or that my friends had taken or that I had seen. And I noticed that if I walked up a little berm, and I was trespassing, but I didn't see any cars, and it was literally right off the road, I was able to sit down and look over the top of the falls, exactly when right before the water went over the spillway. And I was able to create this. And when I looked at this, I said, aha, I finally got an image from a waterfall that doesn't really look like a waterfall, but it has these beautiful reflected trees in the bottom half of the image, and it's got these great shapes from here up. These are all eddies in the water, and then you have some more trees up here, and normally when you're sitting on a rock overlooking a large waterfall that's really rushing really fast, your options are limited. You can slow the shutter speed down and have your camera on a tripod and give the water that silky kind of effect, but you're never going to get this kind of effect out of a large waterfall. The water is rushing much too quickly. But on this particular waterfall, the water isn't rushing that quickly. And so this is literally the top of the falls before it goes right over the spillway, because the current in the river wasn't really moving that fast. And when I took a first look at this, on my computer, on my desktop, I was very satisfied. I said, yeah, this is what I kind of was trying to create. I was trying to create something that doesn't necessarily scream waterfall. And I just thought it really fit beautifully into the quality, of an abstract, image. And it printed really beautifully too. It really created a very nice print. So I was on a workshop once with a great photographer named Brenda Tharp. And I think she still runs workshops, but I think she now travels all around the world to pretty remote places. I was on a workshop with her once on the Pacific Northwest, on the Oregon coast. And we, of course, the group, we were all very excited about shooting the sea stacks and shooting the other rock formations. And we were on a little trail that was on a top of a cliff, and it was eventually going to lead us down to the beach where we could actually start shooting what we kind of came to shoot. But about halfway down this trail, as people were getting excited about seeing the sea stacks in the distance, etc., Brenda said, guys, I don't even want you to think of what you're going to photograph in the next couple of hours. What I want you to do for the next 40 minutes or so is turn around and look at the beautiful formations in this sandstone wall. And I want you to find really interesting patterns and shapes in the wall and photograph those. And she was doing exactly what I'm talking about. She was trying to get us to think in a less literal way and to try and open our minds so that when we got to the eventual destination where we really came to shoot, we would potentially think of the objects a little differently, since we had sort of studied this wall. And I use the same idea when I'm leading a field shoot with students. There's an arboretum near here that has a beautiful mansion, but in the spring, summer, and fall, it's got beautiful flowers and plants. But what I make the students do for the first half hour or so is to study the mansion itself and to try and find interesting things in the mansion, cornices, gates, doors, windows, and I'm doing that for the same reason. I'm trying to get them to think a little differently before we actually start walking through the arboretum. And this was my favorite one. I mean, this has this heart right here, which I really loved. And I just love the way these spokes are coming out of this creation up here. So this was the one that I chose to include in this presentation. And this certainly fits into the category that I'm talking about tonight. Slot canyons, by their very nature, are abstract. because they're all made up of shapes, color, texture, and light, which is really what a lot of photographs in general are made up of. So, this was the kind of image when I first went to the slot canyons that I was trying to capture. And this was one of the more successful captures because I liked the combination of the purples and the oranges and the tunnel that sort of leads up out of the image where the sun is coming from. But when I went back for the second time, and I've been to the slot canyons, I think 3 times total, I started concentrating more on the intimate scenes within the slot canyon. And it's actually, it's hard not to be distracted by what's all around you. But if you narrow your focus to a particular type of object that you're trying to photograph, it becomes relatively simpler. And this is just a small, tiny portion of a huge sandstone wall, but I love the way the sun was coming in again through that tunnel. It was hitting this edge, which is why this edge is lit up. And then the shelf right here sort of throws the rest of these into sort of a shade pattern. And to me, this was, what Elliot Porter referred to as an intimate landscape, although he was referring more to plants and trees. This to me was like an intimate landscape of what's inside of a slot canyon when you can break away from trying to get as much as possible in the image, to try and simplify what you're seeing and create something completely different from it. And, that's a good project to give yourself in general anyway. I normally start wide and narrow. I keep narrowing down sort of what I'm looking at. This was also out west. I forget where exactly this was, but these were like a combination of gypsum and mica stacks. These were almost like mountains. And my choice was to either try and capture the whole scene, which I did, and I turned it into a black and white because these are actually the colors, which is really a lack of color. But then I did the same thing that I just said. I started thinking, well, wait a minute. Within this complex, there are some really interesting individual images that I can capture that make it a much smaller landscape. And to me, this one really spoke to me because of all the lines. They kind of look like fingers. What's on the bottom sort of looks like a giant foot. And so it's taking a much larger scene and trying to get a more intimate, more abstract view of what I was actually standing in front of, which was very impressive in its size and in its height. But that image falls more into the general West landscape category than it does somewhat of an abstract category. Whenever you're out in certain areas, you're going to find mud cracks. The blue in this image is because I'm taking this really as the sun is about to disappear. And it's casting this beautiful blue light on a really pretty big mud flat. But by this time of the day, because of the sun, it was no longer mud. You could just walk on this. And I just walked until I found what I thought was a really interesting pattern, in the mud. And I love the way the canyons almost are really dark, black. And the rest of the image is much more of that really gorgeous blue gray kind of quality to it. And again, this sort of fits into the same category because you can really look at this in a lot of different ways and interpret it a lot of different ways. And then another one that's similar but doesn't have the blue quality was this scene. And I'm not sure what the material was, but it was being pushed up by some sort of uplift, and it was cracking the material, which I don't necessarily think was stone. And it just really created, again, these very interesting patterns, and then you begin to see things like there's a face down here. Here's his eye, here's his nose, here's his mouth right there. You don't necessarily see those things when you're capturing the image. You look at them later and you say, oh, wait a minute, how did I miss that face back there? But this is in a similar vein as the one I just showed before. I live in an urban city, although I live in the north part of Baltimore, which is much more residential. But if you go down into what used to be the industrial area, you see and find these walls of sheet metal that used to be part of a bigger complex. And if they hadn't been removed, time and water creates these wonderful abstract patterns. And when you find one of these walls, they could be like half a block long. And every few feet, you find another composition that's really interesting. But this, for me, was the most interesting one out of this particular wall that I found. And I didn't like the colors, again, that the rust was in this case. So I converted it to black and white, which really was much more effective. And I do convert many more images these days to black and white than I ever have before. I've been doing that for probably about 5 or 6 years now. But this one just looked much better in black and white than it did as a color file. And it's just pure shape, texture, and pattern. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It's just you either like this pattern and like the overall image and see it as something non-literal, which I think in this case is pretty easy, or maybe you look at it and you say, I don't get it. I don't understand what the photographer was trying to capture, in this image. And that's why I call this a personal journey, because I'm not really trying to please, everyone. I'm just trying to please myself with creating these more abstract images. Now, when you find color that's really attractive, then it's easier to say, wait, I'm not going to convert this because I love the complementary of the blue-gray with the tan brown pieces of sheet metal. And this, again, was a tiny piece of a huge sheet metal wall that had just never been removed and was just left out for the elements to do these kinds of things to. And so it's like a gift to a photographer that weather, wore down this, wall to create these wonderful patterns. And again, every foot you found another really interesting pattern to shoot. So it was really hard to figure out which one I wanted to pick, but I really liked this one because of the way that 2 are vertical and 2 are horizontal. I love those little spikes that are coming out at certain points. And I love the black space in between the pieces of metal where you just can't see any detail. And another scene that you can come across is something like this. It's the same wall, but I'm maybe 4 feet away from where that other image was. And I don't know about anybody else, but that figure on the left, to me, immediately looked like a snake. I mean, it's got a body, it's got a head, it's got an eye, it's got 2 nostrils, it even has a little bit of a mouth. And so that is really what caught my eye. And there was another similar snake-like image off to the left, but I didn't like including both of them. I decided I liked just having one. And then, of course, the rest of it is kind of similar to the last image where the colors are so complementary. And again, using theory of thirds, I really wanted that object that I consider to be snake-like to be on one of the thirds. I didn't want that object to be right dead center in the image because I think it just lends more interest to it on one of the thirds. And again, this is an example of when you see something in the literal world, it's just water that created an interesting pattern, in the rust and in the metal. But if you're thinking non-literally, my first thought when I came across this thing was that it had a very, very snake-like quality to it. And that's when you start to say, okay, that's what it exists in the non-literal world. So this is an older image as well, and this is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I was walking from one gallery to the next, and I looked to the left, and I saw this. Now, in the literal world, let me back up. This was one of the first times, because this is an older image, when I looked at the scene in front of me, and I didn't interpret it at first in a literal fashion, because what I first saw were these dark skirts that were coming down, as shadows, and these beautiful energy fields that were coming out of the basins, which of course were created by the lights on the ceiling, just reflecting off of the basins. It was originally sort of a mauve colored file. And so I converted it to black and white, which allowed me to darken down the skirts and brighten up the energy fields that are basically just the basins. But I was so pleased that for one of the first times, I looked at a literal scene, but did not define it immediately, as to what my brain and my eyes were telling me. I defined it right away in a non-literal sense and said to myself, wow, this could make a really cool abstract looking photo. And although you can do abstracts in color, as I've shown, black and white is really a good place to start with abstracts, because it's easier to work in the black and white format when you're talking about shape and texture and line, without the color, potentially distracting you. So I was really pleased with the way the image came out, but I was really pleased with my thought pattern, which was that I didn't immediately see these in the literal sense. I saw them first in a non-literal photographic sense. Some friends and I went to the Philly Museum of Art to see a photography exhibit. We then drove into a neighborhood that was sort of burnt out, because we kind of like, of course, abandoned things, abandoned buildings, abandoned cars. And I just caught this little corner of a building that had been burnt, and the pieces of iron that are coming out of the rebar that basically made up this building, just to me had such an interesting pattern to it. I love the lines, I love the curves, I love the fact that these two don't touch each other. So that's a really important quality. And without the wires coming out of this piece of burnt wood, basically, or burnt post of some sort, the image would really, I wouldn't have captured the image. It wouldn't have been interesting without the wires that are coming out of it. So I just felt that this, again, fit into the category that we're discussing tonight. So most people would probably interpret this for what it is. It is a bridge that's south of Ocean City, Maryland. It goes over the Indian River, and every night they light up the metal spires with these beautiful blue lights. So at first, when the group, and I went to Ocean City with like 3 or 4 friends and stayed in someone's condo, and it was the middle of the winter too, but that's a good time to go to a beach destination. We were first shooting from the ground level all of these beautiful blue spires, but then I noticed that there was a flight of stairs that just went straight up, and I said, well, I wonder what's up there. So I just walked straight up the staircase, turned to my right, and this is exactly what I saw. And to me, although it's still a bridge, in the literal world by capturing this beautiful walkway, because it turned out that it was also a walking bridge. You could walk over the whole span of the bridge. When I noticed these beautiful light and shadows that were being thrown out by these lights that were posted on the side, so walkers could walk at night even and feel safe, I just said, wow, that's just so much better than shooting just the blue spires. I wanted to include them in the image because people that live closer to me, they recognize the blue spires as the bridge that goes over the Indian River. But for people that are not from this area, they don't really have a sense of exactly what this is. And so I thought the walkway combined with some of the blue spires was really much more interesting and potentially more abstract than just shooting the blue spires, although the blue spires in and of themselves are kind of abstract in the way that they stand out in the night. And you can kind of tell that quality. Look at these shafts of light coming down here. Really cool bridge that they light up every night. It's really, really interesting to see. You know, someone could easily look at this image and say, I don't see anything abstract about it. And this one is sort of right on the line, even for me. I was just standing behind this woman at a carnival of some sort, waiting for, I think, ice cream. And I loved the way that her hair was flowing on her back and also over her shoulder. You could actually see the goosebumps on her skin. But I really thought overall it had sort of a, especially because you cannot see her face or any detail of what this woman really looks like facially, I thought it really had an abstract quality to it. And that's why I included it in this presentation. If you could see her face, it would totally take it into the portrait division, you know, and out of any other potential division. And, you know, it was a one-shotter. I just took my camera out and shot, you know, this scene. And I thought it really came out well, especially the contrast between her blonde tips of her hair and her dark hair on the top of her head. I said we like old abandoned things. There are a couple of places about 45 minutes from Baltimore that started out with the idea of being like a used car lot or a junk car and truck lot. But in both cases, that never happened. Both owners of the land and its forest that you're walking through is strewn with old abandoned cars and old abandoned trucks, to the point where you really need to be careful where you're walking, because you can easily trip and bang into one of these objects and potentially hurt yourself. So you really have to be careful. And this is me leaning into one of the abandoned cars and seeing this pattern on the broken windshield. And the minute I saw all those lines coming down with those beautiful crystalline sort of features on them, it was like a no-brainer. It was like, wow, look at how cool this is looking. And then when I looked at it again in the digital darkroom, I said, this has such a cool abstract quality about it. This is an image that a lot of people would really have a hard time figuring out really what I'm shooting. And I love that, as I said before. And I also love these curved lines that kind of cut through, you know, the pattern of this coming right straight down. And the break of the window started up here. And so I was able to just, you know, by adjusting my settings, because then when I stuck my head inside the window, which was broken, of the car, I was then automatically thrown into a darker format. So I had to just pump up my ISO to be able to capture, you know, this cool photo. You know, some are just no-brainers. I mean, this was in an old industrial mill of some sort that I was exploring. and I came across this rusted out yellow barrel, which is what that is, with this handprint on it. And it was like, what the heck is this? How did someone do this? Did they do a stencil and then spray paint it? I mean, did they hand paint it? I was really left to wonder how this scene was even created. But in terms of thinking of something abstract, that's why I said it was a no-brainer, because it's something that the viewer, including the photographer, can't really figure out how it was made and who made it and for what purpose it was made. And so, again, I like images that ask questions that you can't easily answer. And when you go into the abstract world, that happens more often than it does in the literal world, because in the literal world, most images, they may ask some questions, but you're probably going to be able to answer them. Whereas when you're in this world, that becomes a lot more difficult to do. This is my tribute to Harry Callahan, who's one of my favorite photographers. And I was out, this is when we used to get snow, like 6 or 7 inches. So I was out shoveling the sidewalk next to our house, and I looked over to the left where our backyard is, and I saw these sticks sticking through the snow. And they had been branches that had fallen down from a couple of trees that we have. And they had big enough branches, thin ones, that stuck out above the snow pattern, above the snow. And when I looked at this scene, I just immediately fell in love with it, because I saw this torso shape right here. There's her waist, there's her upper body, and there's her legs coming down. I love the way the image sort of moves right to left. All these curves seem to go toward the left. And I love these little guys that look like nail heads. That one, and there's one over here. But they weren't. They were just natural formations, of the piece of wood that was part of the branch. So I said to myself, when I'm done shoveling, I'm going to come out and just take some images, some very, very graphic Harry Callahan style imagery. And I was really kind of pleased with the way some of them came out. Others, I didn't like the pattern of the way the sticks were sticking through the snow. But this particular one, I took a shining to, especially once I recognized this female figure over on the right. So another way to create abstract photography is intentional camera movement. So that's actually what I'm referring to, is literally moving your camera either vertically or horizontally, although it doesn't work nearly as well horizontally. So it's mostly lives in the vertical world. And we were on one of our trips to West Virginia. My camera club goes away twice a year on a weekend trip. And once they found out that I was in the travel business, they sort of approached me and said, well, you probably know more about what you're doing, so would you mind setting up our weekend trips? And I said, no, I'd love to. And I've been doing it now for like 20 years. But it's fun because I look for places that we've never been to before, and I try and keep them within like a 5-hour drive, so it's not too much difficulty. But this is a scene we came across in West Virginia, a tree stand with these beautiful vertical trees. Now, I think even this image has a really interesting abstract quality to it because of the acuity of the scene, how sharp the trees are. But if you put on a couple of neutral density filters, if there's too much light, because you need to move your shutter speed down to about somewhere between 1/5 and 1/3 of a second. And as you fire the shutter, you move the camera vertically, that becomes this. And these were all the rage for a while at my camera club. We called them swipes, because what you're basically doing is swiping the landscape. So, we went from here, which is really so sharp, that it creates a graphic quality of its own, to this, which is just a completely different interpretation of the same scene by just using your tools. using your camera to create an image that looks completely different. And notice, though, that you have to really be good at keeping your vertical movement in the same plane. Because if you move the camera even slightly horizontally, these trees are not going to come out as sharp and as straight looking as these look. And for every 50 that you shoot, you may get one or two that look really good, and all the others don't look as well because you moved a little horizontally. And the moment you move a little horizontally, it takes away the impact of the image. But it's another way. And here's another intentional camera movement. And here's one where I moved both ways. I moved horizontally and vertically and really created more like a painterly scene, but it really is a photograph. But when I looked at it for the first time, I said, wow, this looks like someone could have painted this. And so again, it's just using your tools to create something that doesn't look like it lives so much in the literal world as the non-literal world. And of course, in this image, I love the colors, the reds, the greens, the tans. And that was taken actually at this local arboretum that's about 5 minutes from my house. Playing with your settings is another way to create abstract photographies. We have a light rail system in Baltimore, as well as a subway, although the subway doesn't really go to many places. And I'm on the platform of the light rail station, and my camera's on a tripod, and I'm using like a 6-second exposure to get those beautiful light trails. And none of this is going to move, right? And this bridge isn't going to move. So it really didn't matter how long the shutter speed was. The only thing I wanted the movement to catch were these trailing lights. And they lead you right to, that's the end of the light rail car. And you can see the rest of the car just going down to the left. And so again, playing with your tools is a way to create work that just doesn't look like ordinary work that you see all the time. This is using that trick where you could use a long enough exposure so you can zoom in and zoom out at the same time. And it created these beautiful light trails. This is actually an armory. And these are the lines that were created. These are 3 light bulbs that are right there. And it created this beautiful sort of infinity look where this sort of disappears. And you can clearly see, the brick floor. And what's interesting about this image is that these guys remained pretty in focus, even though I was zooming in and out, and you could see it affected this light because that light is pointing straight out. And I love these lights that are coming out of that upper window. So again, it's playing with your own equipment to somehow create something that looks a little different than what we ordinarily see. We're always told to look up, look down, look to the right, look to the left. Again, I'm in an old industrial building, and most of these are gone, unfortunately. But in this case, I looked up and I saw what I believe to be some kind of light fixture because there are 2 wires that are leading into it that I think are carrying electricity. But I love the way it broke. I love the pattern that it created. And I love the fact that it's actually picking up the reflection of all the junk that's on the floor of what used to be just like an old warehouse building. And I purposely made the iron roof a little slanted. I didn't want it to be completely straight because, again, completely straight is more static than something that's slightly angled or that's curved. Curved lines and diagonal lines or what are called oblique lines, and verticals and horizontals I call them static lines because they really don't have any sense of movement to them. They're framing lines. This is actually close to my house. This is probably an industrial complex that's going to be knocked down. But it's still standing at the moment. And, you could tell at some point what this building looked like when it was in good shape. It obviously was built as a brick building, and then it was stuccoed over with some sort of stucco, and that crumbled and started falling apart, but the bricks are still solid. They're not going to fall apart. And I love the tonality of the blue windows versus the yellow and the red. And then I also noticed that the window right on the right-hand side was capturing a really nice reflection of a tree across the way right in here. And these are clouds that the windows are picking up. So windows are another one of my themes that I like to shoot along with water, because windows give you two qualities. You can look through them, but they also reflect. And sometimes you can do both at the same time. But again, I felt this was an interesting enough and, amorphous enough, image to fit nicely into the category. Just an old window that had been boarded up, but, look at the pattern of the board that the person used. They probably didn't even, realize the pattern that was on the piece of wood. And I really also enjoy that this was probably the original piece of wood that had been, destroyed or rotted away. These were the bolts that were probably holding this piece of wood in place. And when that fell apart, the person replaced it with this more gray and black covering of the window. And again, without those interesting circular and oval figures, it wouldn't really be an object of interest. But when I saw this, I immediately gravitated to that really interesting abstract pattern that was on the piece of plywood or whatever kind of wood it was used to cover the window. Here's a good example of the windows having an interesting quality about them, because these guys have like a textured pattern, but the rest of them don't. But the reflection is perfectly captured. This is the very top of the tree, and it leads all the way down to the very bottom of the tree. So I was able to catch the whole reflection in these particular grouping of windows. And then, there are other things that are being reflected. I think this is another tree, but I'm only catching a part of it. And this sort of looks like a face. So you start to see things that you don't immediately see when you capture the image. There's something in Manhattan, New York called the High Line, which was an abandoned elevated rail train that used to go into the meatpacking district. Well, the meatpacking district hasn't been the meatpacking district for probably over 40 or 50 years, but they had never decided what to do with the abandoned elevated rail line. And some group of people had a brilliant idea, which was to make it into a walking park. And it's now a 2.5 mile park, literally, that you can walk from about West 4th Street to about 30th Street. And you're about 4 stories above the ground. And so because of your vantage point being 4 stories up, you can get really interesting looking images. And this is just a reflection of the building opposite me in the glass building that's right here. And then I noticed that you could see all the balconies right down here, and they're pretty straight, but everything else is really warped and kind of abstract. And that was totally caused by the fact that it was a reflection off the glass building that was opposite it. But it's if you're ever in New York City, Manhattan, you got to get to the High Line. It's a beautiful place and a great place to take images from. So here, here's one of my window shots. And I kind of noticed some of what I saw later. I noticed this face right away. These are 2 eyes. There's a nose. There's a mouth. I mean, it clearly has a facial recognition. But then later, I saw this guy right here, which looks like a cat or a tiger. There's the eyes. There's the nose. There's the mouth. This kind of looks like a skull. It has a skull-like feature. So that's why windows are so interesting, because in this case, you're not looking through them. This is an old abandoned warehouse near where my daughter lives up in northwestern Massachusetts. But whenever I'm up there, because it's not an area that I travel often, for photography, I always try and spend at least a half a day just out by myself looking around the area, because the area that she's in used to be a semi-industrial area. She lives in Greenfield, Massachusetts. And I come across these kinds of scenes in those kinds of areas. Similar window scene, plywood behind the window, and then someone came along and painted a serpent of some sort over everything, but then something happened where the window cracked and broke right here. And what I really liked about it was that you could see the plywood behind it, you could see the glass in front of it, and then you could also have a really clear view of some serpent-like object that someone then spray painted, over the collapsing window. Similar. I don't know what that stuff is. I don't know whether it's a fabric of some sort. I worried for a second that it was asbestos and that I was going to breathe in some asbestos, but I found also near Greenwood, Mass, this was just a broken window that had something behind it, and it was quite far behind it. It wasn't close to the window. It was like on the floor. But what I also enjoyed was the pattern that the window itself was making. The way it broke was really fascinating, because someone broke the center out and it left all these beautiful jagged edges and beautiful lines. So I really enjoyed looking at this image. This is actually sort of like an arboretum, and I think it's outside of Philadelphia. And you have to walk down this walkway to get to the entrance, which is right down here. And as soon as we made a right-hand turn, I said, whoa, stop. I mean, look at the pattern that the sun is throwing on everything, on the columns, on the floor. It just hit me that I had to take a little time and grab some images of this. And these are actually people sitting on the bench, but whatever settings I used, or maybe they were moving a little bit, they don't clearly look like people, which I really enjoyed because it really adds more to the allure of the picture. But the way the sun was creating these beautiful abstract patterns was really, that's what caught my eye. This is actually down in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I have a cousin, and I'm Jewish, so I'm familiar with the Hebrew alphabet. And when I saw these paint chips on this broken cement wall, that's what they really reminded me of. They really reminded me of Hebrew characters. Unfortunately, I lost all of that knowledge, 55 years ago. But that's what it really reminded me of. And again, I thought it fit really nicely in the category because it has really a kind of a cool abstract quality, to it. And it's just paint that's chipping away off of this cement wall. What it was originally, I really couldn't say. But what I have noticed was this sort of looks like a head. There's an eye, there's the mouth. So, those are the kind of things you see sometimes. Just driving in the country and seeing this bush, which was very white, growing on the roof of a shed that was tiled with asphalt tiles. And I thought the branches against the asphalt made for some really interesting patterns. And I thought it had an abstract quality to it. So what struck me with this image is that the sign is lit and it says open, but look what's covering the window. I mean, really strong iron bars. So I think there was a real irony to this image more than being abstract. It was just, yeah, we're open, but you got to come through the door. You're certainly not going to get through this, the window at any point. So it's just something that caught my eye as I was just driving around. I just thought it was ironic that these bars, really, some of them substantial, were covering, the one of the windows. This was like a tavern, in the country somewhere. I've never been good with lens babies. I only have one, which is pretty old. But one day, my wife had put some peaches in a bowl on our dining room table, and the window light from our dining room window was illuminating the peaches. And I said, you know what? I'm going to take out my lens baby and see what I can create. And I think it's all in your mind's eye, whether this is anatomical in some way, whether it represents something else. I just thought the patterns on the peaches, what it potentially implies, really was an interesting and kind of cool, image. And I still don't have much luck with lens babies, but I occasionally play with the one I have every once in a while. So, color plays a large role in all of our images. So when I show you this, which is mostly yellow and some green, it kind of throws off a kind of happy, joyful feeling because of the colors and the way that color impacts us. And I cover that in more depth in my Art of Black and White Photography presentation. But when I turned this into a black and white, it became this, which to me had a totally different quality and a different feel than this does. This turns it much more into a graphic, ephemeral, semi-abstract kind of flower shape, because it really now doesn't look so flower-like. It has more just shape and line and texture, and not color, but that darker shading on some of the bottom leaves really give it a little bit of contrast, and the little bit of darkness on the edges of these leaves also give it a little bit of contrast. And it was just enough to make this really come out the way it came out. And I was really just pleased with it. And then you can always play with macro to create abstract images. What I did with these macros is really just pick one tiny spot to focus on. In this case, it's this drop of water right there. And then the rest of it, because of the aperture that I used, fell completely out of focus, and I fell in love with the curves and the green color in the background. Here's another one. This is just a close-up of a real close-up of the inside of a dahlia plant. And it just sort of gives it a different quality than the other dahlia pictures that I've taken, because dahlias are gorgeous flowers to shoot. And these are just some overlapping petals of a flower that I just really got close in. The focal point is right here, right on this edge, and the rest of it, because of the aperture that I used, just completely fell out of focus. This is one I've taken more recently. I got a new used macro lens from my Nikon, and I actually went out and found some place that actually was selling some. Well, this must be late fall, because that's my backyard grass, and it certainly doesn't look that green. But this is the same kind of effect. I'm really putting my focus right on this line right here, and I'm letting the rest of it completely fall out of focus and sort of melt into the background, which I think gives it a really nice abstract quality. If the whole flower was sharp, it wouldn't have that quality to it. This is just a macro shot at we have an indoor greenhouse kind of place. It's in a Victorian glass building. I think it's only the second one left in the United States. And, this is just me falling in love with this plant because of the hooks that are coming out of it and the spikes that are coming out of it. And literally, I just sat down on the floor and put my camera on a tripod and lowered my tripod and just got some really cool shots of these overlapping, whatever you call them. They're not really leaves, but you know, it's because it's some sort of cacti. And this is what I mean by, you know, this is a calla lily. And again, I'm focusing right here on this curved area, and I'm letting the rest of this fall somewhat out of focus. Now, this was green originally, and it didn't work in green because of the qualities of green. The black background is being created by my TV screen that's just not on, and it made for a great jet black background. But after I did this one, I thought, you know what, I could really play with these. And that became this, where again, I'm just focusing right here, and I'm letting the rest of it fall completely out of focus. And this background, just like the petunia, is sort of melting into the background. And this background was one that I hand painted using my adjustment brushes in Lightroom. I took that black and lightened parts of it and kept some of it on the darker side, like up in this corner. And it was just playing with, you know, the exposure on my adjustment brush. Now, you could also make your own abstracts, and this is showing you how I set it up. I had an extra piece of glass from a picture frame, from a picture probably, and I put a thin white board underneath it and made it completely level. And then I put light underneath the glass and the white board and created things that look like this. And so, you know, if you're interested, this is a combination of food dye, oil, and water. And sometimes I let it just do what it wanted to do. And other times, I think like this one, I kind of moved around. I moved some of it around with a toothpick to give it a little more shape and a little more form. And that's the last image of this presentation. So I'm going to stop share and just open up the floor for any questions, comments. We can look in the chat room to see if anyone put questions in the chat room. There I am. Okay. So
do you want me to read the questions, or do you want to read them and answer?
No, you can read them.
Okay. One of the first questions is from Shashi, and he's asking, can an out-of-focus picture qualify as abstract photography?
No, because that's too simple. If it's out of focus with nothing in the image that the viewer can lock onto, that doesn't necessarily make it an abstract image. So I would have to answer, there has to be something in the image that the viewer can sort of latch onto. So purely out of focus is not abstract. It's just out of focus. There's got to be something more to it than that.
Nelson, you may want to, yours says, what were your settings? You may want to speak to which picture, which photo you're speaking of. If you're still,
I wouldn't remember anyway.
Okay, I'm not sure if he's still on.
Okay.
Okay. The next one is, what is your process of printing?
Well, I just changed my Epson 2880, finally died after about 12 or 13 years, which I thought was really good. So I went out and bought the Epson P700. I have a limited amount of space on a bookcase that can hold my printer, so I couldn't buy the larger one. I'm not sure I even would have. So my printing process basically is to take the images after I work on them into the print module of Lightroom, maybe make some final little fine adjustments, and then just print them. And when it's black and white, I use the Epson advanced black and white engine that's in the printer, and let it, create the black and white, because that advanced black and white driver in all of the Epson printers, I think, is the best black and white driver of any, there's only really Canon and HP, but I think the one in Epson is better than Canon and HP.
That's good to know. Next question is my question. We have our photos evaluated and then judged at the end of the year.
Right.
If you had to pick a type of abstract photo, what type would be the best to put in a show to be judged?
I would say probably a flower abstract because people generally like flowers. And if you can show it in an interesting and different way, I think the judge or judges would be more likely to be attracted to it than some of the other shots that I had in my presentation, which generally speaking, in some cases, they're really not attractive. They could be considered abstract and they could be considered interesting, but I'm not sure how a judge or a panel of judges would react to some of the images that were part of this presentation. So I would say playing with flowers is probably your best bet.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
The next question is from Pat. Do you ever manipulate photos by altering colors and angles to make them non-representational?
No, generally not. I generally try and get it right in the field. I don't play much with hue and tint. I don't really change the color palette that I shot, and I definitely don't angle anything other than what I did in the field. I maybe crop part of the image out, but I don't change the basic way that the image was captured in terms of the angle. So, that's the answer to that question.
Okay. Michael just said that he thought that the picture with the window that looked like a serpent
Yes.
was a bead of adhesive used to hold the board to the window.
Okay. Very
Change your perspective a little bit there.
Yep, definitely changes my perspective. Knowledge is great.
Martin asks, do you consider in-computer manipulation, such as a distortion of a portion of the image?
No.
Or of an image, positive or negative, or is each image judged individually?
Each image is judged individually. I don't even know how to use Photoshop. So I can't do some of the effects that you can do in Photoshop. And I don't think I'd want to anyway, because I consider myself a good enough photographer. And I don't, none of these are one-offs, meaning that every scene, every image you saw, I probably have 10 that look similar to it. And I just pick out the one that I like the best. So no, I don't do any in-computer real heavy manipulation or distortion. Nope.
Okay. Frank would like to know what percentage of these shots are tripod mounted?
Absolutely zero. These were all handheld shots. I really only use a tripod these days when I'm capturing something like water that's moving and I want to create something like that abstract top of the falls. Then I was on a tripod. But no, I don't know. I've just gotten away from tripods with the ability these days of the cameras to do image stabilization at an amazing degree. I just don't really feel that it's necessary anymore. I was certainly trained to use a tripod for every one of your photographs, which for the first couple of years, I did that. The ice shots were all on tripod because, that needed to be, it was slippery, first of all, so you really needed to be stable. And so those were all tripod shots, but those were also coming from the early parts of my photographic life. As my photographic life has gone on, I use a tripod less and less.
Patricia said that most of your photos are in portrait aspect.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they are.
The reason you choose that, and also what are the main qualities you use to evaluate abstract images?
Okay, so I like vertical format because I think it's able to capture much more data than horizontal is. I mean, especially in landscapes. It's just, if you're trying to capture a scene that has a verticality to it, which a lot of scenes do, I prefer that format. I certainly prefer, I like it for street photography. I like it for actual portraitures, which I don't really do much of. I just really got into the vertical format. And it's one of the things that I really struggle with training my students to do, because so many people are used to walking around the world with the camera at their eye level on a horizontal plane. And that's not, that's probably the most literal representation of the world that around us. But changing the format so that it's vertical, it really enables you. And I think if you try it more often, it will enable you to get much more elemental data from the subject matter in your viewfinder, and therefore in the file. So it's something that I just prefer. And what was the second part? What
are the main qualities you use to evaluate abstract images?
I got to be honest, it's just a feel. I mean, that's why some of the images that were included, I even said, this is on the borderline, like that woman with the hair. When I come across something like those sheet metal walls that have parts of them rusting out, and, that to me immediately says abstract, because it gives me the ability to create abstracts just from little parts of that sheet metal wall. In general, though, it's just the quality that the image has. There are certain times when I think originally it's going to be more of a literal image, and when I look at it on the computer, I say, no, this has really got much more of an abstract quality to it than it does a literal quality. So it's really just my personal feel, and that's why I called this a personal journey. I can't teach abstract photography. That would never be a course that I would teach. I can give a presentation like I did tonight, but it's impossible to teach someone other than trying to train them to learn how to look at the world in a non-literal way. There's nothing more that I can do than that. So, as I said, I would never put a course in a catalog that said abstract photography, because it's personal to every single photographer. What's abstract to one is completely non-abstract to someone else. So it's really just pure feel.
On your website, a lot of your shots are shot from the bottom up. So you're looking down at the street up, or you're looking at the base of a tree up. Are you looking for the abstract in the photo to start with? Or is that just your style? Or
I think vantage point is one of the most important aspects of photography, where you stand while you're taking your image, along with your equipment and all the other things. I'm going to have to go back and take a look at my website and see if I see that as often as the person does. To me, it's usually just playing with a different vantage point, because I'm trying to get an image of something that may have been taken by so many other people, but I want mine to look a little different. So it's not necessarily trying to create an abstract. As I said in the beginning, when I go out, usually by myself, looking for abstracts, I don't find them. I just don't find them. But when I'm out just generally doing whatever kind of shooting I'm doing that day, then I find them. It's just, it's so weird. But when you go out with catching them in mind, I just haven't had much luck doing that. So I'd have to take a look at my website and see again if I see how often my vantage point is a little, odd or a little different. And if it's a little different, I'm very happy about that.
It's definitely a style.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. If you look behind me, that's a piece of driftwood. When I took that original picture, I took it as an abstract. When I look at it now, it's a piece of driftwood on a beach. But if I took that picture and just cut a piece of that driftwood out, cropped it out, can I make that photo abstract?
Okay, well, I can't see the photo, so I can't.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I can't comment on that. But I can make a general comment, which is that one of the things that wasn't part of this presentation, because the images are not necessarily abstract, playing with scale is something that every photographer should learn. And what I mean by that is I have images of like a piece of driftwood on top of a huge slab of sandstone. And when you look at the image, there's absolutely no way that anyone could know how big the piece of driftwood is and how big the piece of sandstone is. So in that way, it has an abstract quality. I do that also with, like, I was walking along a beach one day and I found this beautiful weed that was just growing out of the beach. And there was sand on every one of the little leaves that was part of this weed. But again, by looking at the image, you wouldn't be able to tell how big the plant was and how big the beach was that I was walking on. And that's playing with scale. And playing with scale is great because it gets people to think about what they're looking at, because they try and figure out, well, how big is this piece of driftwood and how big is this piece of sandstone? And again, I love creating images that ask questions that don't necessarily get answered so easily. So my suggestion, even without seeing the picture, would be maybe to try and crop it in such a way that getting a feel for how big the piece of driftwood is and how big the sand is that it's sitting on might be your best answer, because it would be playing with scale. And if you can turn that image into one where the scale is not apparent, it definitely takes on an abstract quality.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. That's all the questions that we have in the chat.
Okay.
Everybody can turn their cameras back on if you want. And if anybody else has any other questions.
I had one thing for Lewis. It was really more, I think, of a comment from Katz. He said, I think that might be Death Valley in Zabriskie Point. Was that one of the pictures from Death Valley?
No.
No? Okay. I thought maybe the mud flats. Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
No, I wasn't in Death Valley. That was somewhere in Utah, actually.
Okay. Okay. And then I had something that crossed my mind, because we've announced to our club, of course, you're coming back next month to do an evaluation for us on abstract photography. Well, of course, one of the things that we require are titles for each of our images. How do you come up with a title for your abstract images?
That's a real challenging question. Because our camera club insists on titles as well for scoring purposes. So we get points if it places third or places second. And so untitled is banned. We can't call an image untitled. I gotta just say, you just have to use your creativity and look at the image and try and come up with a title that you think best represents what you've created. It would be very difficult for me to give titles to a lot of the images that I showed you tonight. Very difficult. It really would be. And it's a shame in a way, and I'm not saying that you should reconsider the rule that you put into place, but for an abstract competition, it might really be better to not have any titles, because it's not for scoring. Are you guys scoring in some way when I judge the pictures?
Not for the evaluations, but at the end of the year, we will score them. But, I get what you're saying, because you don't want to say, rose petals if it's an abstract, because you want the viewer to come up with their own idea of what it is.
Right. Yeah. So maybe you guys should give it some more thought and say, well, maybe this one piece of the overall picture really doesn't lend itself to having titles. And because, as I said, I find it very difficult to come up with titles. I got a question here. What do you think about using multiple exposures and or composites to create abstracts? Oh, fully in favor of that. That's a great idea, because again, you're using your equipment and you're using your brain to create something. So it's not like to me, that's completely different from going into Photoshop and distorting a piece of the picture. Composites and double exposures, I think, you're still living in the land of real photography. You're just using some tools that are available to you to create something that looks a little different. So yeah, I'm fully in favor of that.
Okay.
I'm going to ask the question that maybe 3 people are thinking, hopefully more. How do you feel about AI photography?
Not in favor of it.
Okay. Just want to make sure, because if you're judging next week or you're evaluating next week, Want to make sure that we all know that.
Yeah, it's not, it started with people swapping out skies. Sometimes I couldn't tell that that wasn't the real sky, that someone had put in a different sky. I've had opportunities in certain images where you have a blank sky with no clouds to do that. And I've resisted that because I think there are still things you can do with a blank sky that are interesting. You could darken them. You can do certain things without using AI. And I think AI, in certain respects, is going to be the death of certain kinds of photography, and certainly the kind of photography that I do, because it just doesn't lend itself. How does AI fit into doing street photography? I can't really think of how it would. I'm trying to get people, in an urban setting, sitting at a bus stop. I don't want AI to be any part of my process of capturing that image. So it's not that I'm so against it. I just don't think it doesn't add to the overall learning process. And as a teacher, that's what I'm really all about. It doesn't add anything to the learning process that I want my students to learn about how to do really good photography, because it's really using something that's coming out of a computer box that's totally creating something on its own, and I just can't be in favor of that.
Mhm.
But some people do it so well that you can't tell.
Can't tell.
So
Right.
some of the images that I end up judging may use AI, and I won't be able to tell that there is AI in the image. That's fine too. I'm just telling you personally, I have no interest in getting into that.
Well, it's a big topic of discussion, so we're just asking.
Yeah, sure.
you
Sure.
know,
Well, and I probably should clarify for both Lewis and for some of our newer members that we've talked a little bit about our end of year competition. We have various categories like portrait, landscape, pictorial, etc. And there's certain rules about the photos that go into those categories.
Mhm.
Now, for our assigned subjects, of which abstract is our first one of the year, we have 3. There are no rules, basically.
Gotcha.
So, the sky is the limit on the abstracts.
Absolutely.
And for your evaluation, you could see for the other, everybody's allowed 2 images. If one needs to go into abstract, and then the other one can be anything. So
Gotcha.
you might see landscapes and portraits and
Right.
flowers and whatever.
Yeah.
And then at end of year, it becomes important that those images adhere to our standards.
Gotcha.
But, you guys have fun with those abstracts. That's going to be really interesting next month.
It is going to be interesting because it's a fun aspect of photography to play with, because
Right. Right.
playing is part of photography, because if it wasn't fun, well, none of us would do it. But because it is something that's fun to do in so many different layers of photography, that, yeah, having a ball with creating abstracts is definitely something that everybody should be thinking about.
So to close out, let me just give you a timeline. Our next meeting is April the 12th.
Yep, I have it on the calendar.
All right, and Lewis will be back.
Yep.
And for those of you that are submitting images, and we hope everybody will jump on board and try out your abstract eye, those images will be due on Saturday, April the 8th by midnight to our fabulous digital director, Michael Orr. And then Michael will gather all those images, and within the next couple of days after that, he can drop you a Dropbox file. If you'd like to preview them, you'll have the opportunity to look at those images.
I would prefer not to.
Okay, all right, and then you can see them for the first time on the 12th when they all pop up on the screen.
Exactly correct, because I don't want time to. I like judging on seeing them for the first time.
Okay.
Yep.
Super.
All right, guys.
All right.
Thank you very much, and I'll see you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate
All
it.
right.
Oh, and
Everybody head out and start clicking.
I'll send you the survey tomorrow morning that you can pass out to your members.
Okay, we'll do.
Okay.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
a lot. Have a great night.
See you in a month.
Thank you so much.
That's right. See you in a month.